The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, Beatrice Maddox had already read it 11 times. She stood in the middle of the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas, the August heat of 1882 pressing down on her like a physical weight, and she stared at the man she thought she had known, the man she had trusted with the two most precious things she owned in this world, her heart and her son. "You knew," she said, and her voice came out dangerously quiet, which was somehow far worse than screaming. "You knew who he was before you ever set foot on my property. You knew who sent him, and you taught my boy to ride anyway." Andrew Merritt stood 3 feet away from her, his hat in both hands, the brim rotating slowly between his fingers in that nervous habit she had come to recognize over the past 8 months. His jaw was set. His gray eyes, those careful, honest eyes that she had learned to read like a second language, held something she had never seen in them before, something that looked terrifyingly close to guilt. "Beatrice," he said. "Do not," she told him. The letter crinkled in her fist. "Do not you dare say my name like that right now, Andrew, like you can soften this, like you can make this something other than what it is. And what is it?" He asked, and his voice was rough as though the words cost him something. "Betrayal," she said flatly. "Hidden motive. A trap. Every moment of the last 8 months calculated by someone else, and I was the last one in Caldwell to know it." She took a step toward him and stopped, because if she got any closer she was either going to slap him or fall apart entirely, and she refused to do either in the middle of this street. "You had every opportunity to tell me. Every single morning you came to that fence post and watched my son find his courage on the back of that horse, you could have told me the truth. Instead you let me." Her voice broke. She resaid it with visible effort. "You let me trust you." The wind moved through the street, lifting dust in slow spirals around their boots. Somewhere behind her, the general store door swung on its hinges. The town was watching, she knew. In Caldwell, everyone always watched everything. But for once, Beatrice Maddox did not care about appearances. Andrew Merritt opened his mouth, closed it. Then he looked down at his hat with an expression of such genuine anguish that something in her chest twisted painfully against her will. "I never asked for anything in return," he said quietly. "Not one thing, not from you, not from your boy. That part was always real." And those particular words were precisely why this hurt as much as it did. Because she believed him. 8 months earlier, in the brittle cold of a December morning that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be winter or merely an especially unpleasant suggestion of autumn, Beatrice Maddox had been trying to fix a fence post with a hammer she did not fully understand, and a disposition that was fraying at its outermost edges. She was 28 years old. She had been a widow for 14 months. She owned 40 acres of struggling farmland outside Caldwell, a one-room addition that she used as a schoolroom for the 4 ranch families nearby, a mule named Gordon who had strong opinions about everything, and a son named Thomas who was 6 years old and had not spoken more than a handful of words in the 3 months since he had watched his father's horse come back to the barn without his father on it. The fence post refused to cooperate. "Mama," said Thomas, from his position sitting on top of the fence rail, watching her with the unsettling gravity that had settled over him like a second skin in the months since his father's death. He was small for his age, with Beatrice's dark hair and her late husband Cal's serious brown eyes, and he had taken to wearing one of Cal's old bandanas around his wrist because he had seen his father do it, which meant Beatrice could not look at that wrist without her throat closing slightly. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, without pausing her hammering. "The man on the road is watching you," Thomas said. She stopped hammering. She turned. The man on the road was indeed watching her, though watching was perhaps too aggressive a word for what he was doing. He had stopped his horse at the edge of her property line, which she noted with the involuntary awareness that came from months of defending that line against unwanted attention, and he was simply sitting there in a way that managed to be entirely still without being threatening. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, she guessed, lean the way working men were lean, wearing a coat that had seen considerable weather and a badge on his left breast that caught the thin winter light. Texas Ranger. She could see the star from here. "Can I help you?" she called. "Probably not," he said pleasantly, "but I might be able to help you. That fence post needs to go in at an angle, ma'am. If you drive it straight down in this soil, it'll heave come spring thaw." She looked at the fence post. She looked at him. She was tired enough and proud enough that her first instinct was to tell him to ride on, and she might have done it if Thomas had not slid off the fence rail and walked 3 careful steps toward the road, which was the most voluntary social movement her son had made in 3 months. That decided it. "Andrew Merritt," the man said, when he had dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post she had been fighting with, which felt slightly humiliating. "I am riding circuit out of the ranger office in Wichita. I have been assigned to this district for the winter." "Beatrice Maddox," she said, and shook his offered hand because manners cost nothing. "This is my son Thomas." Andrew Merritt looked down at Thomas with the particular quality of attention that some men had with children, and most did not, a genuine, unhurried interest that carried no performance in it. He crouched down so he was at eye level with the boy, which she had not expected. "How old are you, Thomas?" he asked. Thomas held up 6 fingers. "6," Andrew said seriously. "That is a serious age. I was 6 once myself. Do you know what I wanted more than anything in the world when I was 6? Thomas looked at him, said nothing. But his eyes were interested, which was already more than Beatrice had gotten from him in conversation with most people. "A horse of my own," Andrew said. He glanced up at Beatrice briefly, and there was a question in those gray eyes, and she had a sudden vertiginous sense that this moment was a hinge point of some kind, something that would feel important later. "Do you have a horse, Thomas?" Thomas looked at his mother. Then he looked back at Andrew Merritt. Then he did the thing he did sometimes when he was processing something that was too large for words. He reached out and very carefully touched the badge on Andrew's chest with one small finger, then withdrew his hand and looked at the ground. Andrew Merritt did not make a thing of it. He simply rose to his feet, picked up the hammer, and began fixing the fence post at the correct angle. "Your soil is clay-heavy," he told Beatrice conversationally, driving the post with clean, efficient strokes. "You need to slope your fence stakes about 15 degrees east of plumb, or they will work themselves loose every time the ground freezes. Did your husband handle the fencing?" "He did," she said. "I am sorry for your loss," Andrew said, and she waited for more, for the excessive sympathy or the veiled inquiry about her situation or the slow cataloging look that some men gave her when they discovered she was a widow alone on 40 acres, but nothing more came. He just kept fixing the post. "How long will you be stationed in this district?" she asked. "Through spring, at least," he said. "Until the circuit is done or until something pulls me elsewhere. I ride the area from here to Sumner County. Check in with the sheriffs, watch the roads, keep things quiet." He tested the post with both hands. "There you are. That will hold through the thaw." "Thank you," she said, and she meant it simply. He retrieved his hat from where he had set it on the fence rail, put it back on, and looked at Thomas one more time. The boy was watching the horse, a sturdy roan with a white blaze and an intelligent expression, with an intensity that Beatrice recognized as longing. "What is the horse's name?" she heard herself ask. "Ruby," Andrew said. "She is 12 years old and the most sensible creature I have encountered in the state of Kansas, which is not as impressive a compliment as it sounds." He paused. "She is very gentle with children, if the boy ever wanted to meet her properly." Thomas turned his face upward toward his mother. Beatrice Maddox looked at her silent, grieving son, and she thought of the dozens of things she had tried in the 3 months since Cal had died: the talking, the holding, the patience, the books, the long nights sitting beside him while he stared at the ceiling, and none of it had reached whatever deep place Thomas had retreated to after his loss. "Would you like to pet Ruby, Thomas?" she asked. Thomas nodded. One small, decisive nod. It was the most decisive thing he had done in 3 months, and Beatrice felt the back of her eyes go hot with the effort of not showing how much it cost her to keep her voice level. Andrew Merritt led the horse over without ceremony or fanfare, and stood quietly while Thomas put his small hand flat against Ruby's nose, and the roan exhaled warmly against the boy's palm, and Thomas made a sound small and involuntary and nothing like words, but a sound nonetheless. A sound of surprised delight, and Beatrice Maddox pressed her thumb and forefinger against the bridge of her nose and breathed very carefully through it. The ranger looked up at her over the horse's neck. His expression was gentle in a way that had nothing performative about it. He did not say anything. She cleared her throat. "I teach the neighboring children in the mornings," she said. "A small schoolroom. It keeps us and also gives us purpose. Do you take coffee, Mr. Merritt?" "I do," he said. "Then come inside," she said. "It is too cold to stand here and pretend we are not both freezing." That was how it began. He came back the following Monday, and the Monday after that. At first it was incidental. His circuit brought him past her road, and he would stop if he saw her in the yard, or if she had left the gate open, which she began doing without entirely admitting to herself why. He was unfailingly practical in those early months, and unfailingly useful, which she had not expected from a man who carried a badge and rode a government horse. He fixed the lean-to roof before a January ice storm buckled it. He identified the illness in 2 of her chickens before it spread. He brought her mail from town when the road was too frozen for her wagon, not as a gesture of romance, but as a matter of efficient logistics, and somehow that practical honesty was more disarming than any romantic gesture could have been. Thomas watched him constantly. The boy had developed a habit of appearing wherever Andrew was, standing at a careful 3-foot distance as though testing the circumference of something he was not certain was safe. Andrew never pressed him, never coaxed. Simply continued whatever he was doing and reported observations aloud in a low, even voice about the soil, the weather, the behavior of horses, as though Thomas were a colleague rather than a child. It was in the 3rd week of January, on a morning when the ground had frozen hard as iron, and the sky was the particular dull white that promised snow by afternoon, that Thomas finally spoke. Andrew had been checking Ruby's rear hoof for a stone, crouching in the yard, and Thomas had been standing at his customary 3-foot remove, watching. Beatrice had been at the window of the schoolroom, ostensibly preparing her lesson, but actually watching them both through the frost-edged glass. "She doesn't like her left foot touched," Thomas said. Andrew went completely still. Then very carefully he looked up. "You know," he said, with an absolute absence of surprise or excessive reaction that Beatrice recognized as exactly the right response, "I think you are correct. How did you notice?" Thomas pointed at the slight shift in Ruby's weight when Andrew had moved to the left rear leg. He had noticed what Beatrice herself had not caught. The child had been paying attention with an intensity that now surfaced in this single, precise observation. "That is excellent reading," Andrew said seriously. He straightened up, moved to Ruby's right side and set the hoof down. "You watch her like a horseman watches. Did your father teach you that?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "He was going to," he said, "before." The weight of those 2 words "before" fell between them. Andrew did not flinch from it. "Then we are finishing what he started," he said simply. "That is a good thing to do for someone you loved." Thomas considered this. Then he walked forward and stood beside the horse's shoulder, and without being instructed, placed his hand exactly where a horseman places it, open-palmed against the muscle, communicating calm. Beatrice pressed her hand over her mouth and stayed very still at the window. Andrew caught her eye through the glass. He gave a single small nod, not triumphant, not showing off, just acknowledging what had happened, and then turned back to the horse and the boy as though the moment needed no further ceremony. She had been so careful with herself about Andrew Merritt. She had catalogued the reasons clearly. She was still carrying the weight of a 14-month grief. She had a silent child who needed all her available emotional resources. She was in a precarious financial position that made trusting any man's motives deeply complicated. And above all, she had learned from watching other women in her situation that a widow alone on good farmland was a practical proposition to many men and a romantic one to very few. She had itemized all of this. It had not particularly helped, because Andrew Merritt came on Mondays and sometimes on Thursdays, and sometimes on Saturdays if he had been working near the South Road. He never stayed past a reasonable hour. He never looked at her land the way men who were calculating its worth looked at land. He talked to her as though her opinions were interesting, which had been rarer in her life than it should have been, and when she said something sharp or stubborn or contrary, which she did regularly, because she was both sharp and stubborn by nature, he did not attempt to correct or manage her. He either agreed or disagreed as though they were equals having a genuine exchange. She had not had many equals in her life. February brought the real cold, and with it a snowstorm that trapped him at her property for 2 days because the North Road became completely impassable. She gave him the use of the barn, and they had long evenings by the kitchen fire, and she heard about his childhood in Virginia, the kind of poor that had taught him to fix things and identify useful plants and read weather, and his years as a ranger, which had taken him from Virginia through Texas and up into Kansas. He talked about it with the matter-of-fact plainness of a man who had decided long ago that honesty was simply less work than performance. She talked about teaching, about how she had come to Caldwell as a schoolteacher 10 years ago and met Cal Maddox at a church social when she was 18 and he was 22, and how they had built this farm together from raw land, and how she sometimes lay awake in the dark wondering which parts of the life they had built together she would be able to hold on to and which would slip through despite her best efforts. "The teaching will hold," Andrew said, looking into the fire. "That is yours independent of anyone. The farm will hold if you can get through this first year without a catastrophic loss, and Thomas will come back. He is not lost. He is only in a difficult territory." "You sound very certain of that," she said. "I have been in difficult territory," he said. "You do not stay there forever. Eventually the trail comes out." She looked at him across the firelight. He was looking at the fire and his profile was clean and serious against the orange light, and she was suddenly, acutely, uncomfortably aware of the feeling that had been building in her chest for weeks like weather coming. She looked away. She said she was going to bed. She meant it. She lay awake for a long time anyway. In March, Thomas Maddox asked Andrew Merritt to teach him to ride. He did not ask in words exactly. He did it the way Thomas did most important things, indirectly, through accumulated evidence. He had been spending every available moment in the corral with Ruby when Andrew brought her, learning her signals and her preferences with the methodical patience of a child who had decided that this was the most important project in his world. He had read everything Beatrice had in the house that was adjacent to horses: a farming almanac, a livestock guide, a chapter of a general encyclopedia, with the focused application he brought to anything that mattered to him. And one morning in early March when Andrew arrived, Thomas was standing in the corral already, the small leather saddle they kept hung on the barn wall held in both arms, waiting. Andrew looked at him, looked at Beatrice, looked back at Thomas. "All right," he said. He did not make it a lesson in the formal sense. He did not stand at a distance and instruct. He lifted Thomas into the saddle himself, adjusted the stirrups with the same focused competence he brought to everything mechanical, and then led Ruby around the corral in slow circles, talking the whole time about the horse's mind, about what the ears meant and what the tail meant and what the shift of weight beneath you was saying if you learned to listen. Thomas absorbed all of it with enormous dark eyes and a concentration that Beatrice, watching from the fence rail, found almost unbearable to look at directly. They did this 3 times a week through March and into April. Andrew never charged, never mentioned compensation. When Beatrice raised it, he said he did not want anything, and when she pressed he said that watching the boy find his confidence was enough, and his expression when he said it was so plainly honest that arguing with it felt almost rude. Thomas began talking, not all at once, and not without pauses, but with a gathering momentum that Beatrice recognized as the sound of a personality reasserting itself after a long absence. He had opinions about horses and weather and the correct way to store grain. He had questions about the ranger badge and where Andrew went when he rode away, and whether outlaws in Sumner County were worse than outlaws in Caldwell. He told jokes, small, earnest jokes that he had clearly been saving up, and laughed at Andrew's responses with his whole body, the way children do when they feel entirely safe. He started calling Andrew by his first name without being invited to, which Andrew accepted without comment. Beatrice watched all of this happen the way you watch something precious that you are not sure is entirely real, with one eye always slightly squinted, braced for the moment when it resolves into something ordinary. It remained extraordinary. She was 30 years into her life when she first understood what the poets had always been describing, which was perhaps late but which was thorough, because she had enough experience now to recognize the difference between the feeling she had and the various imitations of it she had encountered before. It was not the desperate grabbing feeling she remembered from being a girl, and it was not the comfortable warmth of long partnership, which she had known with Cal, and which she understood was its own complete and precious thing. It was something she had no exact word for a recognition, as though some interior compass had been spinning for years and had finally, very quietly, stopped. She did nothing about it for weeks, because Beatrice Maddox was not a woman who acted on feelings until she had examined them from every angle and identified their sources. She went through the examination rigorously. She asked herself whether she was responding to his usefulness, which would be embarrassingly practical and also slightly insulting to them both. She asked herself whether she was projecting her son's affection onto him, which would be psychologically interesting but not romantic. She asked herself whether the loneliness of widowhood had simply lowered her standards enough that any steady, kind man would look appealing by comparison. She reached the end of the examination in late April, on a warm afternoon when she was grading her students' letters, and he was in the yard with Thomas, and she could hear their voices through the open window, Andrew's steady and low, Thomas's rising with excitement about something, and then a burst of the boy's laughter that was so purely itself, so completely the sound of her son returning to the world, that she put down her pen and sat with her hands flat on the desk and simply felt it. She was in love with Andrew Merritt. That was what it was. She had examined it from every angle and it remained what it was, and there was nothing practical or projected or grief-softened about it. She was simply, clearly, and specifically in love with this man. She picked her pen back up and went on grading letters. She was still not going to do anything about it without knowing more about him. It was this decision, the firm, clear-eyed decision to know him better before acting on the feeling, that sent her to town in early May to speak with Sheriff Hollis Granger, who had known Andrew's circuit and assignment, and would be able to tell her something of the man's history before she committed herself to anything. What Hollis Granger told her was straightforward enough. Andrew Merritt was a 12-year ranger with an entirely clean record, known for being thorough and fair, neither hard nor soft in the way that men in that position sometimes became. He had been married once, briefly, 10 years ago, a woman named Clara who had died of fever in the second year of their marriage, and he had not remarried since. He was respected in Wichita and in Sumner County, and along the entire circuit he rode. He had no debts that Granger knew of, no bad habits that manifested publicly, no known enemies beyond the natural enemies of a lawman's work. "He is a good man," Hollis Granger said simply, which was a thing the sheriff said about very few people. Beatrice thanked him and went to the dry goods store to pick up her supplies, and she was standing at the counter working through her list when she overheard, entirely by accident, a conversation in the back of the store between two men she did not know well, ranch hands from the looks of them, passing through. "Merritt has been spending a lot of time out at the Maddox place," one of them said. "Keeping a close eye on things," the other agreed, and the way he said it had a particular quality that made Beatrice go still. "Dumont's men have been asking about that property," the first one said, "whether it might be available, whether the widow might be persuaded." "And what did Merritt say?" Merritt doesn't say much, the other man said, but you notice he's there every other day. She paid for her supplies and rode home without allowing herself to think about it until she was in her own kitchen with the door closed. Then she thought about it very precisely for a long time. Joseph Dumont was a name she knew. He owned the large cattle operation north of Caldwell, a man of considerable local influence who had made a practice of acquiring smaller farms when their owners found themselves in difficulties. Cal had refused to sell to Dumont twice in the last year of his life, and Beatrice had continued that refusal after, but she had known that the pressure would come again eventually. Dumont was patient and well-resourced and accustomed to getting what he eventually wanted. And now she was hearing secondhand that Andrew Merritt's sudden presence in her life might be connected to Dumont's interest in her property. She did not want to believe it. She also could not dismiss it. She waited. She watched. She noticed, in the weeks that followed, that Andrew never asked about her finances, never asked about her mortgage, never asked whether she had considered any particular offers on the land. She noticed that when Dumont's foreman rode past her road one afternoon and stopped to speak with her, Andrew appeared at the end of the road within 20 minutes, and the foreman left without completing whatever business he had been there to conduct. She noticed that Andrew's presence at her farm seemed to correlate with an absence of other unwanted attention that she had been experiencing before he began riding circuit here. He was protecting her property. The question she could not answer was whether this was the clean, natural protectiveness of a ranger doing his job and a man who had genuine feelings, or whether it was something more calculated, whether he had been placed in this situation deliberately by someone, for purposes she could not entirely see. The letter arrived in August. It came from a woman named Dorothea Mills in Wichita, the wife of a ranger office clerk, who had heard, through the specific information network of small western towns, that Beatrice Maddox was a widow with good land on the South Circuit. The letter was not accusatory. It was kind, even in the way that a woman warning another woman is sometimes kind. It said only that before Beatrice placed her trust entirely in Andrew Merritt, she should be aware that Joseph Dumont had made a private inquiry to the Wichita Ranger office in November, 1 month before Andrew arrived in her district, about who would be riding the South Circuit that winter, and that the response to that inquiry had been provided by the same clerk whose wife was now writing this letter. Which meant that Joseph Dumont had known, before Andrew Merritt ever set foot in her yard, exactly who was coming. It did not prove that Andrew was Dumont's instrument. The letter was careful to say that. But it placed his arrival in a context that she had not had before, and that context was a trap with teeth. She had read the letter 11 times by Wednesday morning, and then she had gone into town to find Andrew Merritt before she did something irreversible, like start to believe the worst of him without giving him the chance to speak, which brought her back to the street, to the dust, to the letter crinkling in her fist and his hat rotating in his hands, and the words she was trying to hold together long enough to say them correctly. "Tell me the truth," she said. "Right now, in this street, I need the truth from you. Did Joseph Dumont have any part in you being assigned to this circuit?" Andrew Merritt looked at her for a long moment. The honesty she had counted on was there in his face, and it did not look like the honesty of a man about to deliver good news. "Yes," he said. The word landed like a stone in still water. "Explain it to me," she said. He took a breath. Dumont made inquiries to the ranger office in November. He wanted to know who was riding the South Circuit. He did not request a specific man or give a specific purpose. "I did not know that he had made those inquiries until March, when I received a letter from my supervisor saying that Dumont had made a follow-up contact asking whether I had assessed the Maddox property for its value and prospects." He paused. "That was the first I knew of it. I did not act on the inquiry. I did not respond to it. I wrote to my supervisor and told him that my circuit work was not in the service of private land speculation, and that if Dumont wanted an assessment he would need to find a different avenue." Beatrice was very still. "You did not tell me," she said. "No," he said, "I did not." Why? He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him choosing between the easier answer and the true one, and she watched him choose the true one, which she had seen him do before, and which was one of the reasons she was standing here in this street instead of having ridden away already. Because I did not know how to tell you without it changing what we had without my being able to explain myself first, he said. Because I knew how it would look. That by the time I discovered what Dumont's inquiry had been, there was already enough between us that admitting to any part of it felt like a dark past I could not explain my way out of, because I was afraid. He said the last sentence without flinching, which cost him something, and she could see it cost him. I was afraid that the truth would end something before I had the chance to show you that the truth was not what it appeared to be. The truth is that you arrived on my land in the context of a hidden arrangement that involved a man who has been trying to acquire my property, she said. Yes, he said, and you allowed 8 months to pass without disclosing that context. Yes, and in those 8 months you taught my son to ride and fixed my fence and sat at my fire and gave me. Her voice did something she did not want it to do. She overrode it. You gave me reasons to trust you. While holding a secret that bore directly on whether that trust was warranted, he said nothing. There was nothing to say. She looked at him, this man who had become, despite her cataloging, despite her caution, the scaffolding of her son's recovery and the involuntary center of her own inner life. She looked at his gray eyes and the honest anguish in them and the hat being slowly destroyed in his hands. She thought about the forced choice that was sitting in front of her, to walk away now with her dignity intact and her heart protected, or to hear the rest of it. You said it was real, she said. The teaching, the all of it. You said it was real. It was the most real thing in my life, he said, and his voice was rough and entirely steady at once. Beatrice, I am not a man who performs things. I do not have the patience for it. What I felt, what I feel is not something I constructed for Dumont's benefit or anyone else's. I know how that sounds given what you have just told me, and I know there is no argument I can make that does not ask you to simply trust what you have observed. I know you are too intelligent to take that on faith alone. All I can tell you is what is true. I came here as part of a circuit. I discovered the inquiry about your property and I refused it. I stayed because of Thomas and because of you, and I should have told you that in March and I failed too, and that failure is mine, and I am not asking you to set it aside. Beatrice looked down at the letter. She looked at the careful handwriting of the woman in Wichita who had thought it worth her while to warn a stranger. She thought about hidden motives and dark pasts and the specific vulnerability of a woman alone. She also thought about a boy's laughter through an open window and a fence post set at 15 degrees east of Plum, and a fire-lit conversation about difficult territory and finding the trail out. I need time, she said. Yes, he said. I need you to not come to the farm for a while. The pain of that landed on his face before he could contain it. He contained it. All right, he said. And I need you to understand, she said, that I am not making a decision right now. I am not forgiving you and I am not ending anything. I am thinking. I understand, he said. She folded the letter precisely in thirds and put it in her coat pocket. She looked at him one more time, at the line of him, the steadiness of him, the man who had taught her son to ride without ever asking for a single thing, and she turned and walked back to her wagon and drove home. She spent 3 weeks thinking. This was not excessive in Beatrice Maddox's view. 3 weeks was the appropriate amount of time to properly evaluate a betrayal, a potential manipulation, a genuine feeling, and the prospects for a future given all of the above. She was not given to hasty decisions, and she was not about to start making them now. Thomas asked about Andrew on the 3rd day, then the 5th. Then the 2nd week he asked with a directness that was entirely his new self, the talking, returning, full-voiced self, and said, "Did Andrew do something wrong?" Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "He kept a secret he should not have kept," she said, because she had decided that Thomas was old enough for the approximate truth. Thomas thought about this. "Is it the kind of secret that makes him bad?" he asked. "Or the kind that makes him scared?" Beatrice looked at her son. He was 6 3/4 and had been watching people carefully since before he could name what he was watching. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think Andrew doesn't like being scared," Thomas said. "I think he is better at being in charge of things than at being scared of losing things." He picked up his book. "I think he should have told you, but I don't think he was bad." She considered her son for a long moment. "When did you become this wise?" she asked. "Andrew said I was a good observer," Thomas said, without looking up from his book. "So I observed." On a Saturday afternoon in the third week, Beatrice Maddox put on her good coat, drove into Caldwell, tied her horse in front of the sheriff's office, and asked Hollis Granger where Andrew Merritt was currently based. Granger gave her a look that contained a complete story in itself. "He has been camping out near Skillet Creek," he said. "Has not rented a room. Has not taken meals in town. He is either doing an extremely thorough job of monitoring the South Road, or he is processing something significant." "He is processing something significant," she confirmed. "The Dumont business," Granger said, which told her that he knew more than he had said when she had come to him in May. "You knew," she said. "I knew Dumont had made inquiries," he said. "I did not know if Merritt knew. And then when I saw the situation developing as it was, I did not feel it was my place to intervene in something that was none of my official business." He paused. "I should perhaps have told you sooner. For what it is worth, Merritt wrote to the Ranger office in Wichita in March and formally refused any connection to Dumont's interest. I have a copy of the letter. He asked me to hold it in the event that it became relevant." He opened his desk drawer and produced a folded letter. He put it on the desk between them. She read it. Then she read it again. It was a clean, clear refusal, dated the 17th of March, which was 3 days after the evening she had first been aware of what she felt for him, and had spent the night lying awake not acting on it. The letter stated without embellishment that Andrew Merritt would not serve as a source of intelligence for Joseph Dumont's land interests, that the South Circuit would be conducted according to Ranger mandate without regard for any private party's objectives, and that if further contact was made through official channels for this purpose, he would file a formal complaint. 3 days after the 17th of March, she realized, was the day he had lifted Thomas into the saddle for the first time. She folded the letter and put it back on Granger's desk and sat with her hands in her lap for a moment. The timeline was important. It meant that by March, before the teaching had begun, before the firelit evenings had become something she let herself think about at length, he had already chosen. He had not told her, and that was a genuine failure. But he had chosen. "Where exactly at Skillet Creek?" she asked. She found him at dusk, which she had not intended. She had simply miscalculated the time, and it meant that the light was doing the particular things it did in a Kansas August evening, going gold and then red across the creek water, and Andrew Merritt was sitting against a cottonwood with his boots off and his hat over his face, which was such an entirely solitary and unguarded posture that she felt she had arrived at a private moment. She tied her horse. He heard her because he was a ranger and he was not actually asleep, and he moved the hat from his face and looked at her with an expression that was so carefully without hope that she understood he had been sitting here for 3 weeks making himself not hope. She sat down across from him on the bank of the creek, close enough to talk, far enough to think. "I read your letter to the Wichita office," she said. He said nothing. "You wrote it on the 17th of March, she said. "Yes," he said. "Before the writing lessons began." "Yes." She looked at the creek. The water was low for August, moving slowly over flat stones. A bird she could not name crossed the far bank and disappeared into the brush. "I want to understand something," she said. "You knew from March that your presence on this circuit had been looked at by Dumont. You refused any connection to it, but you still did not tell me for 5 months." She turned to look at him. "Why?" He looked at the water for a long moment. "Because in March I was a ranger on a circuit and you were a woman on a property I was charged with protecting," he said. "And by April I was something different, and I did not know how to account for the gap between those two positions without sounding like I was constructing an explanation after the fact." He looked at her. The truth is that I was afraid you would make the same calculation you made last week, and I was not ready for you to make it and have it come out wrong." "You were afraid," she said. "I told you that in the street," he said. "It has not changed." She looked at him, the man who had fixed her fence and taught her son to ride and sat at her fire and chosen, in March, before any of the important things happened, to refuse the hidden arrangement he had been placed in without his knowledge. She looked at the way he was sitting, very still, with his hat held in both hands again, and she thought about the forced choice she had been sitting with for 3 weeks. She had not, she realized, been choosing between trusting him and not trusting him. She had been choosing between the version of safety that kept her at a distance and the version of courage that required her to step into something uncertain with her eyes open. Beatrice Maddox had never in her life chosen safety over courage. It was not how she was built. "You should have told me in March," she said. "Yes," he said. "Or in April, or in May, or in June." "Yes," he said. "And you are not going to do that again," she said. "Keep things from me because you are afraid of how I will receive them. I need you to understand that I would rather have the hard truth than a comfortable gap where it should be." He looked at her very carefully. "Are you?" He stopped. He started again. "What are you saying to me right now?" "I am saying," she said, "that you made a significant mistake and I understand why you made it and I am not willing to let it be the end of this." She held his gaze. "I am also saying that you do not get to make that choice for me again. I get to decide what I can carry, not you." The expression on his face was almost difficult to look at directly, too raw and too real and too much itself. He looked away briefly, and she could see him working to contain it. "I understand," he said. "Good," she said. They sat for a moment by the slow water with the red light going off the creek's surface and the night sounds beginning in the cottonwoods, and the whole complicated weight of the previous 8 months settling into something bearable. "Thomas asked about you," she said. He looked at her. "He said you were scared rather than bad," she said. "He is a very accurate observer." Andrew Merritt let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long-held. "He is the best horseman I have taught," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "He is your biggest advocate in this situation," she said. "Which speaks well of your character with him, even if it is slightly mortifying that my 6-year-old has better analytical clarity than most adults I know." 6 3/4, Andrew said, and there was the beginning of something in his voice that was not quite humor but was adjacent to it, and she felt the knot in her chest ease by a measurable degree. 6 3/4, she agreed. She looked at the creek. He looked at the creek. Somewhere upstream a frog commenced its opinion about the evening. "Andrew," she said. "Yes. I came here in good faith to have a conversation that was already very difficult," she said. "I did not intend for it to become more difficult." "And has it?" he asked. She looked at him. "No," she said. "That is the thing. It has become considerably less difficult, which is somewhat irritating because I had a very well-organized series of positions I was prepared to defend, and now I find I do not need most of them." He was quiet for a moment. "Would you like to tell me what is left of them?" "One," she said. "I need to know that whatever this is between us, is what you are choosing for its own sake, and not because you have been sleeping beside a creek for 3 weeks feeling guilty." "I have been in love with you since February," he said, with the exact same directness he used for everything. "Before I knew there was a Dumont question to navigate, before Thomas took his first lesson. I was in love with you by February, and I have been in a state of considerable personal conflict about it since March because I could not figure out how to address the question of Dumont without potentially losing what was already the most important thing in my life." He paused. "That is the complete truth of my position. February." She thought about February, the snowstorm, the long evenings, the firelight, the sense of recognition. She thought about herself at the window, pressing her hand to her mouth. "I believe you," she said. He exhaled. "Good," he said quietly. She stood up, because she had been sitting on a creek bank in the dark for longer than was strictly practical. And she had a son at home with their neighbor Mrs. Garrity, and she had lessons to prepare for tomorrow morning, and her life was a specific and ongoing set of responsibilities that did not pause for conversations by creeks, however significant. Andrew stood as well, and they were close in the fading light, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the specific current that had been running between them for months was very present and not at all resolved by the conversation they had just had. She put one hand flat against his chest, steady, deliberate, the way Thomas had touched his badge on that very first day and felt him go still. "Come back to the farm on Monday," she said. "Thomas has been working on his posting trot and it needs your attention." "All right," he said, and his voice was very careful. She took her hand back. She turned and untied her horse. She mounted with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing it all her life. "Beatrice," he said. She looked back. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You did not have to." "No," she agreed. "But I am a person who acts on things when I have thought about them enough, and I have thought about this enough." She gathered her reins. "Good night, Andrew." "Good night," he said. She rode home in the dark with the summer stars beginning their work overhead, and she was smiling by the time she crossed her own gate line, and she did not attempt to manage that. He came back on Monday. Thomas was out in the corral before Andrew had even tied Ruby to the post, demonstrating the posting trot with a precision that made Andrew stand with his hands on the top rail and watch with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated pleasure that Beatrice, bringing coffee to the fence, felt the remainder of her careful distance dissolve like sugar in warm water. Things were different after the creek conversation in the way that all the things that have been named and survived are different, not more tentative but more honest, as though the hard part having been gotten through left them both with a cleaner view of what remained. He was careful with her in the way of a man who understood what he had been given and did not intend to be careless with it again. She was direct with him in the way of a woman who had decided that she was not going to spend any more of her life navigating around things that could simply be said. They argued twice in September, once about how to approach the fall planting rotation, and once about whether Thomas was ready to canter yet, and both arguments were conducted with complete honesty and resolved without drama, which she found more intimate than most tender things she had experienced. In October, Joseph Dumont made a personal visit to her farm. He arrived on a Tuesday morning when Andrew was in town on official business, which Beatrice did not think was a coincidence. He was a large man in a good coat, with the particular manner of a man who had been agreeable so long in the pursuit of his own objectives that he had begun to confuse agreeableness with charm. He stood in her yard and offered her a price for the property that was fair, even generous, and explained that she was facing another hard winter with aging infrastructure and a marginal farming operation, and that a clean sale now would give her capital to relocate and start fresh somewhere less demanding. Beatrice listened to the entire offer with perfect composure. Then she said, "Mr. Dumont, I am going to tell you something plainly because I think you are an intelligent man who will appreciate directness. This farm is not for sale. It was not for sale when you sent inquiries about it last November, and it was not for sale when my husband was alive, and it is not for sale now. It is mine and it belongs to my son after me, and no figure you name will change that because this is not a financial decision. It is a permanent one. I would appreciate it if you understood that clearly so that we do not need to have this conversation again." Dumont looked at her for a long moment. He looked around the farm, the solid barn, the repaired fences, the neat schoolroom addition, the corral where Thomas was visible in the middle distance. "You have had good help here this year," he said. "I have," she said. "I hope it continues," he said, with a politeness that was not entirely a compliment. "I expect it will," she said. He tipped his hat and left without further negotiation. She watched his horse down the road until it was out of sight, and then she went inside and poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down and let herself shake for approximately 4 minutes, which was the amount of shaking the situation warranted, and then she stopped shaking and went back to her lessons. When Andrew came home that evening, and she had begun thinking of his arrivals as coming home, which was not a thing she examined too closely but was simply true. She told him about Dumont's visit. He went very still in the way he did when something significant was registering. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Completely," she said. "I told him it was not for sale and he left. I want you to know that I handled it entirely without difficulty, and I am not reporting it because I need to be protected. I am reporting it because I told you that we would not keep significant things from each other." Something moved in his face. "Yes," he said, "you did say that. I also want you to know," she said, "that his visit made it very clear to me that this property is mine in a way that I needed to feel again after everything this year. Which is useful in the sense that I have been wondering whether to hold on to it long-term or consider other possibilities." "What possibilities?" he asked carefully. "That depends," she said, "on what the next several years look like." He looked at her across the kitchen table. The fire was going because October had turned cold and the light was the same warm orange it had been in February, and she was struck by the full circle of it. "I should ask you something," he said. "You should," she agreed. "But not tonight," he said, "because I have not yet resolved the question of the circuit and I do not want to ask you something important until I know what I am offering." She considered this. "How long will you need?" "I need to speak with my supervisor in Wichita," he said, "and make some arrangements. A month, perhaps." "A month is acceptable," she said. "You know what I am going to ask," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have known for a while." "And," he said, "and I will give you your month," she said, "because you asked for it honestly and because it is the right way to do this, and because I have waited this long and I am not going to manage impatience badly at this stage." He smiled. It was the full version of his smile, the one he did not produce often, and it changed his face completely, not into someone different but into a more visible version of himself. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "They occasionally resemble each other." November came in with cold, clean air, and frost on the grass and Thomas turning 7, which was marked with a chocolate cake that Beatrice made from a recipe she had kept since before her marriage, and the 4 farm families whose children she taught coming to the farm with their children for a small celebration, and Andrew arriving with a gift for Thomas that was so perfectly chosen that she had to briefly turn away so the room would not see her face. It was a proper writing crop, small, well-made, the kind used for English-style posting work with Thomas's initials engraved in the handle. It was not extravagant. It was exactly right, and Thomas held it with the reverence of a boy who has been given something intended to be kept for life, and said, with his new full voice, "Thank you, Andrew." "You have earned it," Andrew said simply. The month passed. The circuit was resolved. On a Saturday in late November, when a thin snow had fallen overnight and the world was very white and still, Andrew Merritt arrived at the farm in the early afternoon and asked Thomas if he could speak with Beatrice alone for a little while. Thomas, who understood far more than most adults gave him credit for, said he was going to the barn to check on the horses. He took his riding crop and his dignity and departed. Andrew stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, that familiar, beloved nervousness, and said, "I have resigned my commission." Beatrice looked at him. "I have put in for a position with the Sumner County Sheriff's Office," he said. "It is a deputy position based in Caldwell. I will not be riding circuit. I will be here in one place." He paused. "It pays less, but it is the right arrangement for someone who intends to build something that stays in one location." She was quiet for a moment. "You gave up your commission," she said. 12 years is a full career," he said. "I did not give up anything I had not already been considering. The circuit work is for men without reasons to stay anywhere. I have a reason." "Andrew," she said. "I know what I am asking," he said. "I know your circumstances are not simple and your history is not simple, and I know you are not a woman who is going to accept anything less than a full and honest partnership. I am not offering you anything less than that. I am offering you my complete truthfulness and my complete commitment, and whatever years I have ahead of me. And I am asking if you will let me be Thomas's father in the ways that a man can be a father to a child who already has a father in his memory." He had not moved from the spot where he was standing, and his hat had survived the conversation better than usual, which perhaps indicated he was getting steadier. "I am asking you to marry me." Beatrice Maddox looked at this man. She looked at the 12-year ranger who had become a deputy for the sake of staying, and the patient teacher of her son, and the fence fixer and the keeper of a fire, and the man who had told her the truth at considerable cost to himself, and then sat beside a creek for 3 weeks without trying to manage her decision. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. He came to her and took her hands and held them with a steadiness that she had come to understand was his essential quality, not the absence of feeling but the presence of it held with great care. She looked up at him. "You are going to need to learn to plant things," she said, "if you are staying here." "I have been watching you do it for nearly a year," he said. "I expect I can manage. And you need to understand that I will continue to run the school," she said. "I would be disappointed if you stopped," he said. "And Thomas makes his own decisions about what he calls you," she said. "I will not engineer that." "Agreed," he said. She reached up and touched his face with the flat of her hand, the same deliberate, precise gesture she had used at the creek, and she felt him still under it. "Then we understand each other," she said. "Completely," he said. He kissed her then with the same quality that characterized everything he did, unhurried, fully present, and worth the wait. Thomas came back from the barn in about 20 minutes, assessed the situation in the kitchen with the observational precision of an excellent horseman reading signals, and said, "Are you getting married?" "Yes," said Beatrice. Thomas nodded. "Good," he said, with the definitive simplicity of a child whose world has been returned to order. "Can I be the one to tell Ruby?" They were married in January of 1883, in the church in Caldwell, on a Thursday morning when the ground was frozen, and the sky was the same thin, brilliant blue that appeared in Kansas between storms. Holly's Granger stood as witness along with Beatrice's nearest neighbor, Mrs. Garrity, who cried through the entire ceremony and had brought 2 handkerchiefs in anticipation. Thomas stood at Andrew's left side in the good suit Beatrice had made him for the occasion, holding his riding crop, serious and proud, and when the minister pronounced them married and Andrew turned to look at him, Thomas said "Congratulations" in his best formal voice, and the church laughed, and Andrew shook his hand as though they were equals, which Beatrice noted was exactly the right thing to do. The winter of 1883 was cold and productive in different ways. Andrew learned to plant, as promised, under Beatrice's instruction, which she provided with a combination of genuine knowledge and mild enjoyment of his early failures that he accepted with good humor. He settled into the deputy work with the thoroughness he brought to everything, building a reputation in Caldwell for being fair and steady, and for knowing when to use authority and when to stand back. He was not the kind of lawman who made himself important through force. He was the kind who made himself unnecessary through prevention, which Holly's Granger said was the best kind. Beatrice expanded the school in the spring, a proper addition to the main schoolroom, with 2 windows and a real blackboard that Andrew and a neighbor built over a February weekend. She took on 2 more students from farm families further out, and began teaching through the full year rather than just the winter months, and found in the expansion a kind of purpose that she had always known was her own center, and that had now been properly given room. Dumont made no further approaches to the farm. Word traveled in Caldwell, as word did, that the Maddox property was no longer a viable prospect, and that the new deputy had a clear view of the road from his office in town, and Dumont's attention moved to opportunities that required less complication. Thomas turned 7 in November and 8 the following November, and continued to become more completely himself with each month that passed. He was serious and observant, and had developed a talent for mathematics that surprised his mother, and satisfied something in Andrew that she suspected was genetic. He had stopped wearing Cal's bandana around his wrist by the summer, not abruptly, not at any named moment, but gradually, the way grief releases its specific gestures when they are no longer needed. He kept the bandana in the small box by his bed, which she saw as exactly right. Not discarded, not worn, but kept properly, belonging to a part of his life that was real and complete in itself. He called Andrew Dad for the first time in June, out in the corral, in the middle of a conversation about the correct weight in the inside stirrup when turning, without any ceremony or prior announcement. And Andrew's response was to continue the conversation about the stirrup without skipping a beat, which meant the moment was absorbed without being made into something that needed managing, and Thomas had been using it naturally ever since. Beatrice, who had been at the fence rail and had witnessed it, had gone into the house and cried for approximately 6 minutes in the kitchen, which was entirely reasonable and which she had entirely earned. In the autumn of 1883, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Andrew on a Sunday morning when they were both up before dawn in the way they often were, he from habit, and she from the particular wakefulness that had hit her in the 3rd week of her condition before she had named it, and they were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee in the early dark, and she put down her cup and said, "I am going to have a child." He was still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands and looked at her with an expression of such open, unguarded joy that she thought for a flashing, clear moment that this was what the inside of his face looked like when it was given complete permission, and it was beautiful. "When?" he said. "April," she said. "I believe I will need to see the doctor." "April," he said, as though placing the word in the correct location in the calendar. "That is a good month." He turned her hands over in his. "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling somewhat ferocious," she said, "which I gather is normal at this stage. I'm also feeling entirely certain about it, which I think is the most important thing." "Yes," he said, "that is the most important thing." Thomas took the news with his customary analytical approach. He asked several precise questions about the logistics of the situation, declared that he intended to teach the child to ride as soon as it was old enough, which he had determined through independent calculation to be approximately age 5, and went back to his book. Beatrice and Andrew exchanged a look over his head that contained an entire conversation. The pregnancy was uncomplicated by the standards of the time and place. She continued teaching through the winter, as she had always intended to do, dismissing the suggestions of those who thought she should rest by pointing out that she had been teaching in this county for 10 years, and that her students' education did not pause for biology. Andrew was unfailingly present without being hovering, a distinction she appreciated considerably, and handled the heavier physical work on the farm through the winter months with a matter-of-fact competence that she had stopped noting as remarkable only because it had become the expected standard. In April of 1884, on a Thursday morning, she seemed to favor Thursdays for significant events. Beatrice delivered a healthy son. They named him Calvin James Merritt. Calvin for Cal, because it was right and honest to carry that name forward, and James for Andrew's father, and Merritt because he was born into this family as it now was. Thomas met his brother with an expression of extreme assessment that eventually resolved into satisfaction. He touched Calvin's hand with one careful finger, precisely the gesture he had used to touch Andrew's badge in that very first meeting, 2 years and a lifetime ago, and said, "His hands are very small. He won't be able to hold reins for a while." "No," Andrew agreed, looking down at his son with the full version of his face again, the visible one. "But he has time." The spring came on in the way Kansas springs do, sudden and insistent, filling every available space with green after the long white months, and the farm that had been built by one marriage continued its life in another, which was not a lesser continuation but a different and full one. There were things that still needed doing. The fence on the north side needed replacing, which Andrew and Thomas undertook on a Saturday in May with the focused teamwork they had developed over 2 years of shared projects. The school needed new books, which Beatrice spent 3 weeks writing letters to achieve, and which arrived in June in a crate from a publisher in St. Louis. Ruby needed her shoes replaced, which Andrew did himself as he always had, with Thomas supervising and commenting with the expertise of a boy who had been seriously studying horses for a year and a half. There were also things that had been completed. The silence that had settled over Thomas after his father's death had lifted entirely, replaced by a voice that was now one of the most constant sounds in the household. The dark past of Dumont's interference had been resolved into something they could look at directly without flinching. The secrets that had stood between Beatrice and Andrew in that terrible August week had been named and survived, and were now simply part of the history of how they had come to understand each other's essential character. The forbidden feeling she had spent so long managing, the love she had refused to act on until she had thought about it from every angle, had been given its full name and its full life. In the evenings, when Calvin was sleeping and Thomas was finishing his lessons and the day's work was done, Beatrice and Andrew sat by the fire the way they had that very first winter, and the conversations were longer and easier, and ran the full length of what they were both made of, her practicality and his steadiness, and their shared belief that honesty, even when it cost something, was worth considerably more than comfort. She told him once, on a night in late summer when Calvin was 3 months old and sleeping on her lap, and the evening was warm enough to have the door open, that she had known in February, that specific February evening when he had said the word trail and meant it as a metaphor for grief, that she was going to be in trouble. He thought about this. February was the snowstorm, he said. Yes, she said. I knew in January, he said. She looked at him. January. The day Thomas touched the badge, he said. I knew that if I was not careful I was going to be completely lost in this situation, and that I was probably not going to be particularly careful about it. That was the first week, she said. Yes, he said. I was rather faster about it than I would have predicted. You managed to keep it concealed for some time, she observed. I am a ranger, he said, with the dry quality that appeared in him sometimes when he was comfortable. Or I was. We are trained to maintain composure under significant pressure. And now, she asked. He looked at her across the sleeping baby and the fire and the open door to the summer night. Now I am a deputy in Caldwell, Kansas, he said, with a wife who is the best teacher in 3 counties, and a son who will be an excellent horseman, and a son who is currently attached to your lap. And I do not feel the need to maintain composure about any of it because I have no interest in concealing how I feel about this life. Calvin stirred and resettled. The fire shifted. Outside, Ruby moved in the corral, and Thomas called something from his room about the correct Latin name for a bone in a horse's leg, which he had read in his encyclopedia. Beatrice answered him with the correct name. Then she looked at Andrew, and he looked at her, and the full weight of the ordinary, extraordinary evening settled around them like something that had always been there, and had merely been waiting to be claimed. In the years that followed, Caldwell changed around them in the way that Western towns changed in the 1880s, growing and shifting, and occasionally erupting into the kinds of difficulties that came with cattle markets and railroad money, and the friction between the old open-range ways and the new fence-country ways. Andrew moved from deputy to sheriff when Holly's Granger retired in 1886, which Granger said he had anticipated for some time, and which the town ratified without much debate because everyone in Caldwell had already made their assessment of Andrew Merritt's character and found it sufficient. Beatrice's school grew from a room on her farm into a proper district school in 1887, with a building the county provided, and a second teacher she hired and trained, which gave her back her mornings for the younger students while the older ones moved up. She had lobbied for this with the same combination of precision and stubbornness that she brought to anything she had decided mattered, and the county had eventually concluded that arguing with Beatrice Merritt was a poor investment of anyone's resources. Thomas grew into someone who was recognizably the child he had been: serious, observant, thorough, and also unmistakably the product of two parents who had taught him that work had worth and honesty had value, and the care of others was not a burden but a fundamental way of being in the world. He had his mother's sharpness and his father's steadiness, and his birth father's eyes, which he carried without apology as the particular inheritance they were. He was an extraordinary horseman by the time he was 12, exactly as Andrew had predicted, and he taught riding with the same patient, unhurried quality he had received. Calvin grew into his hands and everything else by the age of 4, and was exactly as complicated and exact and full of opinions as two such parents produced. He was louder than Thomas and faster to laugh, and had Beatrice's way of walking into a situation with complete directness. And Andrew watched this with the particular combination of recognition and awe that parents feel when they see themselves in a child, and find the reflection both familiar and entirely new. In 1888, Beatrice had her third child, a girl this time, named Margaret, who arrived in October with red hair that neither parent could account for, and an expression from her first hours that suggested she intended to be thoroughly in charge of everything. Andrew held her the night she was born with both sons asleep down the hall and the whole house quiet, and looked at Beatrice with an expression that she had learned over 6 years of studying his face, was his gratitude in its most complete form, not said because it was too large for saying but entirely present. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am excellent," she said, which was the exact truth. "She has red hair," he observed. "She does," Beatrice confirmed. "My grandmother had red hair, I had forgotten." "Margaret," he said, testing it. "She looks like a Margaret," Beatrice said. "She looks like she is already planning something." "She is 4 hours old," he said. "She is 4 hours old and she looks like she is planning something," Beatrice confirmed. "She is going to be remarkable." "She is already remarkable," Andrew said, and this was also the exact truth. The stars over Caldwell were very bright that October, and the town was quiet, and the farm was solid and warm, and the fences ran straight and true at exactly 15 degrees east of Plum, and the horses were in their corral, and the schoolroom was full of books and chalk and the evidence of daily use, and the kitchen fire was warm, and the people in this house were entirely where they belonged. There was nothing hidden between them, no dark past that had not been brought into the light and examined and survived. No secrets kept from fear, no forced choices that had not been made deliberately and fully. No betrayal that had not been resolved into understanding and the stronger foundation that came after. There was only this: a man who had come to fix a fence and taught a boy to ride and asked for nothing in return, and a woman who had been sharp and careful and brave enough to know the difference between the appearance of a thing and its truth, and a family that had been built from those two qualities combined. The trail, as Andrew had said long ago by a winter fire, did eventually come out. You did not stay in the difficult territory forever. You found your way through, if you were willing to look at the map honestly and move toward what was real. Beatrice Maddox, Beatrice Merritt, lay in the warm house with her daughter and her husband and the sound of her son sleeping down the hall, and she was precisely where she had always been going, and she knew it. Outside, the Kansas night settled around the farm like a second home. Everything was accounted for. Everything was held. Everything was, at last, completely itself.